So I just put a set of EMGs into my Explorer. Why EMGs? Well, I kind of like all my guitars to have a very specific purpose. So in that regards, I have my Strat to be my single coil guitar. I've got my hollow body PRS to be my P90 guitar. I've got my Les Paul to be my humbucker guitar. So now I've got my Explorer to be my active pickup guitar. The set I'm using is a set of EMG 8160s because, let's face it, I'm a Hetfield fanboy. So why not own it and just be completely shameless with it and go the full Hetfield. I thought about getting the headset, but at the same time, Hetfield didn't record And Justice for All using the headset. He used a set of 8160s, so I have a set of 8160s. Do we see how this works? No, I'm pretty certain we can see how this works. I kind of like the Fishmans as well as the EMGs, but to me the Fishmans was sort of a cross between passives and actives. And as I said, I want my guitars to be like very focused on one particular purpose. So since I wanted greater separation between all my guitars, I went the EMGs rather than the Fishmans. So after putting the actives into my Explorer, I did some comparisons between my Explorer that has the EMGs and my Les Paul that's got a set of JBs, and I found the difference between active pickups and passive pickups to be a little bit more significant than I expected. I also found out that some amps respond better to active pickups and some amps respond better to passive pickups. It wasn't like it was a clear cut, this is better and this is worse thing. It really came down to what amp you were using and what you were playing. So being the tragic nerd that I am, I recorded the same piece of music with my JBs and the same piece of music with my EMGs and reamped it through all my metal amps to sort of see what worked better where. Also, once I'd recorded all those differences and sort of sat down and listened to them, I noticed that I had kind of basically put together a high gain shootout between all my different metal amps, which is something else I'm sure people would find interesting as well. So as a result, this video is going to sort of be Metallica Worship because I have EMGs, so therefore I recorded a lot of Metallica riffs. I'm not even sorry. This video will also be a comparison between active pickups and passive pickups, and this video will also be a bit of a shootout between all my high gain amps. There's a lot going on, I hope you enjoy it. All the tones were recorded through the MESA 4x12 with a single 57 on the front, so I'm not doing this in a band mix because I really wanted to highlight the difference between the pickups, so I didn't want other things getting in the way, I just wanted you to hear the pickups. All amps were recorded through my MESA 4x12 with a single 57 on a vintage 30, and all of them are in a high gain setting. We're just going for knuckle dragging, chugga chugga good fun here. I mean, why else do you think I got a set of EMG 81s? Come on. Between each test, I'll have a little bit of a chat about the amp itself and whether or not I prefer the passives or the actives and what I liked about both ones. I'm sure the differences are going to be fairly obvious anyway, but you know, it doesn't help for someone to point out the differences every now and then. Also, one thing that I noticed is when I was recording this, you kind of needed that break between the amp tests because you're having to listen so hard that eventually after like 2 tests, everything just sounds weird to you. All you can hear are the differences. So you miss the full picture of what the amp sounds like. So yeah, it can be annoying for me to jump in every couple of minutes and say, hey, here's what I like, guys. But as I said, when I was recording these tests, that little break in between each thing I actually found very valuable. So I'm doing this for a reason and not just to get my face on camera, which nobody wants. The MESA Rectifier is one of those legendary amps, and I mean, everything has been said about MESA rectifiers. If you want to do a deep dive on MESA rectifiers, please go over to Riffs, Beards and Gear, Fluff's channel. That man knows everything about rectifiers, and he is going to say anything about a rectifier better than I can. But pretty much in the 1990s and early 2000s, every band was using MESA rectifiers, and not just metal bands either. The thing that I find about MESA rectifiers is that even though there's a lot of this really smooth saturation, the note underneath that saturation stays really, really clean. You can really hear your guitar underneath all that saturation. That being said, I do find rectifiers can be a little bit flubby and not that great for rhythm guitar unless you do a bit of work to sort of control that bottom end and to sort of make it punch hard. But that being said, plenty of bands have used rectifiers for rhythm sounds and got amazing sounds out of them. I mean, check out Nevermore. I also think Cannibal Corpse was running rectifiers for a while there as well, with all their drop tune stuff. So yeah, I mean, you can definitely use them for high gain rhythm and they're going to sound amazing. Now, in terms of which I preferred here, the actives or the passives, I mean, we gotta acknowledge that the EMGs sounded pretty amazing here. I'm tempted to just say EMGs sound great in a rectifier and leave it there. It's a combination that's been done a million times over, and I think that video just is a great demonstration of why. I also think that this is a really good demonstration on the main difference between an active pickup and a passive pickup. While a passive will really focus on the pick attack, you know, the new information that's been sent down, the EMGs will really focus on capturing the entire note and make sure that that is sent down. So with the passives, you get a lot of dynamics and a lot of punch coming through because you got that pick attack always jumping out and really making itself heard, which can be really, really great in complicated mixes where the guitar is getting lost a little bit. That little pick attack spiking out can really sound awesome. However, with the actives, you end up with this really big sense of size. Since you don't just have this focus on the pick attack, rather you got the focus on the whole note, when you're going chug, you get the entire chug. You don't just get like the ch, which sometimes is all you get from a passive, you end up getting the entire thing. So in something like a MESA rectifier, that means an EMG just sounds huge. However, that little punchy dynamic attack from a passive pickup, that can be the difference between your guitar sitting well in a mix and punching through when you need it to, or sometimes getting a little bit lost. Rectifiers were, as I've mentioned, notorious for their over-the-top bass response. What I actually found was that that was easier to tame and control with EMGs, because since EMGs are so consistent, you can sort of set everything up right and you're going to get the same result for every single note. Look, realistically speaking, I think the passives and the EMGs work really, really well through the rectifier. I'm just going to give it to the EMGs because, hey, they're new, so it's probably a novelty for me at the moment, but I'm going to give the edge to the EMGs. Okay, I've done a big, massive deep dive on the Marshall JVM before, so I'm not going to do that here today. I want to emphasize that the JVM is amazing at pretty much any gain stage, but obviously for today, we're just focusing on the high gain stuff. Now, when it comes to high gain, the JVM has by far the most amount of gain out of all of these amps here. Like, it doesn't even come close. It's all focused on this really savage and aggressive pick attack, which, if you're not careful, can get really out of control really quickly, but that's kind of what makes it so awesome. Makes it really, really good for genres like death metal or thrash metal, and if you absolutely crank the hell out of the gain, yeah, it can even work for slam metal if you want to throw some hammers around. Now, believe it or not, in this test, I actually liked the EMGs with the JVM rather than the passive pickups. I want to stress that that's only in this high gain situation. For pretty much everything else, I definitely prefer my JBs through the Marshall rather than the actives. But as I was just saying, the JVM has a monstrous amount of gain, like way more than anybody could ever reasonably use. Since the EMG is such a clean and controlled pickup, playing an EMG with an amp that's got this much gain is a really, really good pairing because it makes it easier to control the amount of gain going on. So at lower gain settings, the fact that this amp is always like screaming and bucking and being a little bit unpredictable, that can be really good. But in a high gain situation, sometimes you want it to actually be a little bit more controlled, a little bit tighter, a little bit more focused on where it is. So yeah, long story short, if you've got an amp and you're playing it at ridiculous gain settings, yeah, something as clean and precise as EMGs is probably going to be a very big help for you. Another amp I've done a big deep dive on was the MESA MkV, so again, I'm not going to do that here today. We're just going to focus on the high gain side of things. Now, the high gain channel of the MESA MkV is very precise, it's very consistent, and it's this very jagged sort of screaming sound. It's killer for something like thrash metal or for progressive metal, where you need every note to be heard exactly correct. That is something that the MESA MkV is going to do perfectly. Which means it makes perfect sense to me why James Hetfield would love MESA MkVs and why he would love EMGs into MESA MkVs. And look, I'm not even going to pretend like I'm not horribly biased here. The first thing I did when I got the EMGs hooked up was I came home, I plugged into my MESA MkV, I turned it on, and straight away I had Metallica noises. As a utterly shameless, stinking fanboy of Metallica, that gave me joy that I'm not even gonna pretend wasn't there. I was excessively happy with that, and I still am. So like when I plug my EMG 81 into my MESA MkV, I sound like Metallica. That wins for me. But let me break this down a little bit more scientifically, sort of, to explain why it's such a good pairing. What I found about the MESA MkV is that it's an amp that is really fussy about what gets sent into it. It doesn't really like gain pedals being thrown into it. It doesn't even really like compressor pedals that much. I mean, it sort of does. It can cope with them, but it doesn't love them. This is an amp that wants to do all the work for you. It doesn't want you to do any work, and it doesn't want you to put any work into the amp. What I found with the MkV is that if I tried to help the amp by boosting it with any sort of pedals or with a really aggressive pick attack on passives, it ended up having this really sharp ice picky sort of response that is sometimes really hard to get rid of. Meanwhile, with the EMGs being as consistent as they are, the MESA MkV absolutely loves that. The EMGs give the MkV an ultra clear, ultra consistent signal, which means the MESA MkV knows exactly what it's getting, it knows exactly how it's going to respond to every single note, and it's just in a very happy place. And honestly, the MkV loves the EMGs with pretty much every gain setting. It loves them clean, it loves them mid gain, it loves them high gain, as I think I've just demonstrated. So yeah, the EMGs into the MkV is a clear winner for me. But the takeaway that I get from here is that if you've got an amp that doesn't like to be pushed or punched in the face, EMGs or active pickups are probably going to work really well for it. But the important takeaway here is that if you've got an amp that doesn't like to be abused, if it likes, if it wants to be treated nicely, shall we say, then active pickups are probably going to be a very good pairing for it. So at this point in time, I'm tempted to say it's a 5150 and leave it at that, because the 5150 is probably the most common metal amp of all time. Pretty much every single high gain plugin is modeled on a 5150. You just can't get away from the 5150 if you're in the world of high gain. I want to be a grouch and be like, oh, I'm so over the 5150. But honestly, there's a reason why they're so well loved. They've got this really thunderous bottom end that kind of just sits right in the mix. They've got this honky mid-range, which might not sound great by itself, but in a mix, it's what helps your guitar cut through, so you'll kind of always hear your guitar no matter what. And also what I find unique about 5150s is that while there's a lot of saturation, it tends to be voiced a little bit lower than what it is on other amps. So that means once you've got a high cut in and you've taken out all the high frequencies above like 8K, you tend to not lose any of the saturation. All that saturation is still kind of in the tone. So it ends up being a really good way of keeping your guitar sounding, saturated and overdriven, even in a really busy mix. You've heard this amp a million times, but honestly, there's a good reason why you've heard this amp a million times. Now, the other thing about the 5150 is that a 5150 kind of sounds like a 5150 100% of the time. They're not really that fussy about what you throw into a 5150. It's going to sound fairly similar most of the time, and I think that this was a good demonstration of that. I mean, yeah, there were differences, but they weren't massive compared to like the JVM or the Mark V, where there were some really big obvious differences. So as a result, I think your preference here is going to be based on whether or not you prefer the sound of active pickups versus passive pickups. So yeah, I don't think that there's a clear winner here, but at the same time, definitely don't think there's a loser either. And now we get to my favorite metal amp of all time, the Bogner UBERSCHALL. Now for my money, the passives are the clear winner here. The Uber is this amp that has insane levels of saturation and just canyon-esque low mids that just fill the room no matter where you are. But even though they've got like this really big sound and they're called like an UBERSCHALL, which makes it sound like they're going to be these super aggressive things, I mean, they kind of are, but I also find them deceptively pretty. I often find that once I have an UBERSCHALL sitting in the mix right, I'm always like, wow, that actually sounds kind of nice. They're effectively a Marshall that's been hot rodded to absolute oblivion. So they kind of end up being a cross between a Marshall and a Recto. It's sort of like that they've taken a Marshall, put the Recto bottom end on it, and sort of given it that Recto character on top of it. So like the core tone is Marshall, but everything else is rectifier. It always sounds huge. It always chugs just like an absolute demon. It's really dynamic. It works great with chords and everything like that. Yeah, it's just a fantastic amp. Now, unlike the JVM, the UBERSCHALL has really controllable gain. And that means it handles the dynamic punch of passives really, really well. Now, those low mids I mentioned before that I love so dearly, those can be really problematic when using an UBERSCHALL. If you're not careful, those low mids can really kind of swallow everything up and you just kind of end up losing all note definition. And this is why I think the passives work so well with it. The passives with their punch and their dynamics and that real focus on the pick attack, the extra that, that passives do, I feel like that's really cutting through, so that means you never end up really losing the note. On the other hand, with the EMGs, since they're focused on giving the whole note through, I'm assuming, is some level of compression built into the pickups, sometimes those lower mids do end up swallowing the note a little bit and you don't quite get as much punch or dynamics, and it just sort of ends up sometimes being a little bit sloppy. You end up with something that sounds huge, but you don't end up with something that sounds punchy, and you don't end up with something that sounds aggressive. You just kind of end up with size. which, don't get me wrong, is pretty cool. I mean, it still sounded great if you ask me, but I do think that that punch and dynamics that the passives have to offer really go a long way to making the UBERSCHALL sound great. So overall, I definitely prefer the passives with the UBERSCHALL. So yeah, I have found these results to be pretty interesting and not quite what I expected. I don't know what I did expect going into this, but what I got wasn't what I expected. I think it's really demonstrated that both actives and passives have their place in high gain. It just really depends what amp you're playing and kind of what style you're playing as well. Like, if size is the most important thing to you, I would consider looking at a set of actives so you get like that whole note thing I keep ranting about. Meanwhile, if, pick attack is super important to you and, really having a punchy sort of sound is really important to you, so, something like thrash metal, I'd probably maybe consider leaning towards the passives. Personally, I still prefer playing my JBs more than I prefer playing the EMGs, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't have a great time playing the EMGs as well. I mean, I can't deny the sheer fanboy joy I get from plugging EMGs into my MESA MkV and playing Metallica riffs all day, as I'm pretty certain you can tell. So effectively, the conclusion I have here is that I've got my JBs for when I want to be musical and dynamic and exciting, and then I've got the EMGs for when I want to throw hammers or pretend I'm James Hetfield. I hope you found this video interesting and I hope you found it good fun. I had a lot of fun recording this. I mean, I got to record a bunch of Metallica riffs. Yeah, I had a blast. So if you enjoyed this video, please feel free to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.